everybody, Aaron James here. So since my first, blog post slash video about knitting tips seems to be very popular, I figured I would address my second one of the other questions I get asked all the time, especially being in the fiber industry and handspun and spinning fiber and spinning wheels and all of that is, what I'm always hearing is, oh, it's beautiful, I love it, but what do you make out of it? And that's usually what I hear from people who are longtime knitters or crocheters. And, that most likely started out buying yarn at craft stores, and that's still what they're most comfortable with. I feel like in most of your local yarn shops, there are lots of, even amongst the normal yarns, as I call them, there's a big variety now. So it might not be as common of a question, but I still get that all the time of I love it, I want it, but outside of petting it on my coffee table, what do I do with it? So I had written a blog post a while back, similar to the knitting tips one, and it was called what do you do with handspun? So I thought I would do the video companion for this one too. And so I have my the kids are napping, I have my counter full of mini hand knits. So here are the tips. So tip or suggestion number one is, I guess one of the most notable things you would see on handspun, and this is a beautiful, I didn't even make this one, Kristen from Rosemary and Twine made this one, but it's my yarn, I can claim the yarn. They have kind of a slight variation. This is one of my really popular bases. It's the Merino Chunky 2-ply. So you can see that there's slight variation. I mean, not tons, but some stitches are a little bigger and then some are a little thinner, just depending on when you spin singles, the nature of the beast, especially with mine, because I like it that way, so I don't agonize too much, are if you have two thinner pieces that kind of come together, you're going to end up with a little tighter stitch, and then if you have kind of two bigger stitches, you'll have kind of a big one, and I love that look personally. And I think that scares off a lot of people when they're looking at it in a hank or a skein. I go back and forth on that. I think they look at that and they're like, oh god, it's going to look so weird, or it's going to throw off my pattern. And this is, like I said, Kristen did this one, and it's beautiful. And of course it will look funny on me now. It's a headband, and I love it. But with her, this is a more complicated, traditional cable going down the middle. You can see it didn't throw off her pattern at all. It all kinds of comes out in the wash, I find, on most patterns. Of some stitches are a little smaller, some are a little bigger, but this is a perfect example, I think, of how you can follow a really traditional pattern, like a cable stitch. And I mean, come on, people, who invented cable stitches? I'm pretty sure it was a bunch of old Irish ladies, and they traditionally were hand spinners. So I mean, most yarn used to look more like this. It wasn't all the perfect stuff you see now. So this, as you can see, is a beautiful pattern that has come out with the bulky weight, thick and thin, and it all comes out. It's fine. It's even. It's the same size. It doesn't do anything weird. So I would just say the slight variation in gauge, I think, is what throws a lot of people off when they're just looking at the yarn. And if you're looking at patterns, I of course go on Ravelry. And I label most of my yarns, I imagine most hand spinners would too, of kind of slightly thick and thin. My bulkies, I would say this is bulky weight, but some of them, especially the more single ply, I would say kind of between worsted and bulky. If you were looking for a pattern, I would maybe go up, especially if you're a tighter knitter. So if you were searching for yardage, if you were searching for this pattern, and I don't know if it's on Ravelry or not, you'll have to ask Kristen, I would put in, 80 yards, bulky weight yarn, accessory, and then if something like this would come up, then that's probably going to work. And, your pattern's probably going to come out very similar to if you'd used regular yarn. So like I said, I just kind of wanted to show an example of, this is a slightly thick and thin, and it came out really nice. Same thing with this one. This is another designer collab I did, and it was called the Divine Torque Beanie, and this was my yarn from the Goosebumps Halloween collection. It's also got the cable down the middle, and this one was really cool. It's got a seed stitch, so that's an example of seed stitch, and then you've got your your ribbing on the bottom. And I love this hat. I always get so many compliments, and that's the same base. Like I said, this is one of my more common bases that way. And so, like I said, I would say definitely don't let the slightly thick and thin gauge scare you off. This is it in single. Single ply, that was kind of, so these may be a little bit scattered for tips. This is double ply yarn, and that's where you have the two singles that get plied together and they make a double ply, and that usually kind of like evens out the yarn. I also love single ply, which brings me to, I think it was tip number 2. Which is, don't be afraid of single ply. It is, I always describe it as more rustic because it's not, it's not as even. When you 2-ply them together, it kind of evens it out, like I was talking about, where like the thick part and the thin part might kind of go together, and you know, very much like the rest of me. So just like my arms, the thick and the thin part go together, and it all evens out. Where if it's single ply, you're really gonna see the thick and the thin, and you know, some yarns are more exaggerated. I have an exaggerated thick and thin. And this is a silk that I did a few years ago, and this is just mine. It's a really simple, just kind of like neck wrap that I did, and it's single ply. And it was because this was some hand-dyed silk, I loved it. But you can see the variation on that, where you do have some thin parts and thicker parts, and I just love it. So like I said, and that's an example of how a single ply, which benefits of single ply is, especially like I said, this was silk, and it wasn't, I don't even, like I said, I didn't do this when it was a gift. This is pretty light, so I mean, it was probably like 1 1/8 ounce or something. So if you're spinning or if you're buying, single ply yarn will definitely give you more yards for your weight, I guess. So like this is hand-dyed silk, it was expensive. So by leaving it as a single ply, I was able to get enough yardage to make this lovely neck wrap, which I wear a lot. It's like a necklace and a scarf all in one. And I always get lots of compliments on it, and that's a great example of single ply yarn and why you should not be afraid of it. It can look a little, it can, you know, like I said, it can look a little special as a skein, and so I think that's where a lot of people's questions come in, is once again they get really wigged out about like gauge. And if you want to email me, I will be happy to hold your hand and walk you through that. But I'm pretty like fast and loose on stuff, so I'm like, I'm gonna make that. Then I do, and I've never had anything come out that I wasn't happy with. So let's see, what was drape of fabric. One thing to pay attention to, and let me see what are my best examples here, is, well, the ones I have here. This being a 2-ply bulky, just like you would want to pay attention to drape when you were knitting or crocheting with any yarn, you know, just like a mill-spun cotton yarn is going to hang different than like a mill-spun, like worsted, you know, wool yarn is going to be much springier and tighter, and then like a linen cotton, something you're going to make in the summer, is going to be much more like, you know, what's the word I'm going for here? Like loosey-goosey and drapey. So it's the same concept as with any old regular yarn. Just pay attention. If anything, it's more fun, because in handspun, you're probably highlighting the whole like fibers more than, you know, I don't think regular yarn highlights their fibers as much. But so Exhibit A, this is 100% silk, and you can see it's very like drapey. And so this is, and it's got some stretch. I mean, it's knitted ribbed, so it's pretty stretchy. But so keep in mind that this has got a different drape than this does, and that's 2 layers of it too, so that's probably like, but see, this holds its shape a little bit better. This is a merino wool, so it's very like stretchy and springy and soft, but it doesn't have, so if you were knitting something out of handspun yarn, and it's, I don't know, a shawl, let's say a shawl. So you're knitting a shawl out of handspun yarn, and you want it to be like lacy and loose and drapey, I might go for something that was maybe more of a single ply, or a blend of some sort, like alpaca, that has a pretty drape, more so than like maybe a sturdier wool, because the wool, even though it probably would make a fabulous shawl, I have many a shawl made out of this, it's gonna be more of a like warmer, bulky, like out and about doing some gardening kind of shawl, more so than like a little lacy, like drape over your shoulders, go to dinner kind of shawl. So just same idea that you'd want to keep in mind for any sort of knitting or crochet project is just, I mean, see how this one's like over my hand? This is a single ply silk versus this one, I mean, I got it like on one finger and it's still holding its shape of a 2-ply merino bulky. So just keep that in mind. So that was tip number 3, maybe. The other one, let's see, we already covered don't be afraid of single ply yarn. Oh, the last and probably my favorite tip is all what I just showed you have all been 100% hand spun projects, which there are free patterns on my site, Crafty Housewife Yarns. There's a big button that says patterns, and there's some free ones on there. And I think I am, since I'm lucky enough to be friends with several designers, we'll probably have some patterns that people smarter than myself have written coming in the near future that I think would click and redirect to their website. We're not quite sure how we're doing that yet. But the ones on there now I have written, so they're free. And, you know, no hating. They're not the most official, but they work. And they use, I think the next tip was do not be afraid of mixing hand spun and commercially spun, mill spun, whatever you want to call it, yarn. This is also by my friend Kristen at Rosemary and Twine, and it is a wonderful example. I just wore this all over Denver and everyone loved it. The brim is single ply. This is a great example of single ply worsted weight merino yarn, hand dyed and spun by myself. And then this middle part is alpaca. It's wonderful. And it looks like it also looks like a single ply. So it's single ply, but it's, you know, commercial yarn she got at a store somewhere. And it's really nice. And as you see, where they join, it looks, I mean, it's seamless. It's beautiful. And so, like I said, you've got your slight variation we've already talked about, but I mean, really not that much. It's really not that much. The slight variation in stitches, you can see they're all lined up perfect. And most importantly, you can see where it connects to the commercially spun yarn. I mean, it looks great. And so then, of course, the pom-pom is the fun hand spun too. And so doing projects like this is a great way to, like, if you fell in love, say you're in a shop, or you happen to have spun it yourself, or you get it from me, because, you know, why not? Fall in love with a, like, fabulous rainbow skein of something, and then you're like, now what do I do with this crazy thing? You can buy a really nice traditional, like, I love gray. Gray's like my jam, as you can tell. It goes with everything. Just get some nice, like a cream or a neutral or a white or a gray or a black, any of those, and they go great. And then this wasn't even one skein. Like, I think she's made a few of these, and I liked it so much I bought one to make the pom-pom and the band. I mean, you make yourself one and your best friend. And that's a great way to use those together. So a couple more examples of that. Oh, this pattern is on my website. I also wore this all over Denver, and I love it. It is a drop stitch cowl, and this is one of the, I got this as a kit at a local shop, made some, like, really crazy, like, even for me, crazy. It has, like, ribbons and stuff in it, like art yarn, which, like I said, most of my stuff isn't quite this wild and crazy, but this one was for me. So I made that section, is that. And then this section was also, like merino silk and sparkle. So those two are hand spun, and then the gray, this is just it was very affordable at my local yarn shop, merino wool. And so this pattern you can, I love this. It's on my site. I forget what it's called. I think it's called the Fisherman's Net Cowl. That's it. But it's wonderful, and I love it. But it's a great example of, I took two different skeins that happened to go, they weren't matching, but they, like, went together. You also could have, if you just had one, you could have just done this and then done all the rest in the yarn from your local yarn shop. So that way you're supporting your local yarn shop too. But I love this pattern. I've had people send me lots of pictures of this pattern that they've made, which always makes me happy. So if you make it, you have to send me a picture or tag me on Instagram or whatever. And I love this pattern. It's super easy. I knit this one up in the car coming back from my brother and sister-in-law's with my kids screaming at me in the back, so it probably kept me from jumping out the window. But it's super easy. It's a drop stitch. It makes a lot of it makes a lot with your yardage. It's a bulky weight yarn. But I just love this because, like I said, you can use it with other things, so that kind of answers the what do I make out of it question. You make this. This is what you make out of it. And just going down examples at this point in time, I made a sweater. So this is one of my favorite designers, Alicia Plummer. Her, if you are familiar with her, this one was, oh my god, I forgot. I keep wanting to say Campside Cardi because I just did that one. This was Postgrad, that's what this is. But sweater part is from Knit Picks, just their Wool of the Andes, which I love Knit Picks, see the other video. And then the collar was a really pretty hand spun that I made. So you can't see too well, but yeah, I did this whole collar on this sweater in hand spun. And same idea, this one's on my website of another way to use. So this is all for tip number 4 of mix it with commercial yarn. This is a cotton merino commercial blend yarn, the green, and then this is a hand-dyed hand spun silk. So this little pattern you can either make big and it can be a shawl, or you can make it smaller and it's like a bandana wrap, which I also love. So that's also an example of tip number 4. And I don't have other stuff, so I'm just going to keep talking. So congratulations for the longest, most rambly video ever. These were examples of crochet. Everything I've shown, because I'm more of a knitter, is have been knitting, but Cocoon, shout out to my friend Heidi, who uses a lot of my yarn in her fabulous hand crocheted items. This is a hat I got from my husband. It's crocheted. So this is some really like rustic, really warm cordell. So this is all hand spun, and that's crocheted. And like I said, she's way more talented in crochet than I am, which is why I have to show these. This one is a cable stitch in crochet, which I didn't even know you could do that, is how limited I am in crochet. But this was also an example of hand spun, and this was one skein. So, and this is a pattern I think I'm going to sweet talk her into posting or selling for us. Her pattern, we did some kits a while back on my site, but this is one skein, so around 80 yards, bulky weight, hand spun. So that was, if you have hand spun, you can probably make something similar to that. And this is the Spaceballs hat you can find on Ravelry, and this was single ply. That was the point of this one, was to show off the coolness of the different gauge in the single ply. And one more thing, this is all hand spun, and it was another Alicia Plummer, I believe it was called Wharf. So that was using, you can use 2 different colors of hand spun. So anyhow, I've rambled at you long enough, but I hope that helps. I think I covered all the tips. So going over the tips real quick, it was take into consideration the slight range in, like it might be a combo of like worsted to bulky or DK to worsted, and kind of when you're looking at patterns, honestly, you can, if you're searching on Ravelry, you can look under both. Like look under both and see where it figures in, and you can kind of adjust your needle size. Or maybe you might get away with, if it called for worsted but you're using bulky, you can probably use less yardage. So that's probably a good tip. So that's tip number 1. Consider your drape on what your final outcome you want it to be, like stiffer or drapier or looser, while you're choosing your hand spun, not just your regular yarn. That's important for hand spun too, and I think it makes a big difference because there's so many different variations of fiber. Tip number 3 was, don't be afraid of single ply yarn, as you've seen in many of those things. It's awesome. So love me some single ply yarn. So that makes a lot out of a little. That's always a good thing. And last but not least, mix it with other stuff. So it's the ultimate stash buster. Go check out my site. We have patterns. Go check out Ravelry. Honestly, anything that you see that is a pattern that has more than one color of something, you can be like, I'm going to use that that cool accent part can be hand spun. So it's pretty easy to work in with other things, and it always looks great. And that way you can save money on the store-bought yarn and then spend money on the hand spun. Or if you already had expensive hand spun, you can get cheaper store-bought yarn. So hope that helps. Leave comments or questions, and I'm sorry this was so long. Anyhow, I hope everybody enjoyed that, and happy knitting or crocheting. And yeah, more to come on why we should all have hand spun.